Do you ever wonder how great leaders in the community make things happen? When they encounter new, unexpected challenges like a pandemic, how do they continue to successfully make an impact? Welcome to That Sounds Terrific, the podcast that connects you with these amazing people. Get insights on what they do to meet their goals, find out how you can help them in their mission, and learn their methods so you can be more successful at what you do. Welcome to That Sounds Terrific with host Nick Koziel.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of That Sounds Terrific. Today, joining me from all the way in the UK is David Simmonds, chairman of HCM Metrics. Thanks for being on the show, David.
Well, it's delightful. It's one of my favorite topics, and it's great to be talking to you all.
Well, that's awesome. Why don't you just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, your employment history and things like that, how you kind of came to do what you do?
Sure. Thank you. Yes, I've been in HR, I've been in human resources all my life, specializing in learning and development. I worked in many corporates, big companies and small, public and private, telecoms, financial services, health, education. Then developed in HR consultancy and worked on 6 continents around the world. Latterly, I've worked also in universities, helping people get their professional qualifications, certifications, and also their master's qualifications in HR. About 5 years ago, I went on a workshop called HR Analytics. And I thought, no, that doesn't make sense. How can you have HR and analytics in the same sentence? However, I thought, I've seen the future. Just over 2 years ago, I became aware of a new international standard, ISO. Many of us will have heard of ISO 9001 for quality and others for environment and health and safety and cybersecurity. They published a brand new ISO for human resources. I went online 9 o'clock in the morning, downloaded this, first person in the world to download this new standard from Geneva, Switzerland. ISO 30414 enables us for the first time to measure human resources, and we can now set the ROI of HR.
Well, that's awesome. I know that there's been a buzz about that, and it's cool to kind of meet somebody who's starting at the very beginning of that. Because I know in business, there's always some sort of, well, not always. There's often a kind of a conflict between ROI and HR, and how we go to HR when there's a problem or when we need to hire somebody. But what does that really reflect in ROI? So can you talk a little bit about that and what you found?
Yes, thanks, Nick. I think you've hit the nail on the head that classically, traditionally, HR has been seen as a reactive, passive, transactional function to do with hiring and firing. I want to see it shifted into the boardroom, into the C-suite, where we can see HR taking its proper function, proper role as a leader of organizational strategic change. And what this standard will do is to give the metrics, the evidence, the instruments, in order that HR can achieve what it's been doing all these years by proving its outcomes. It's not really just about HR, but it's transforming that function to meet the KPIs, the KRAs of the organization, whatever they happen to be. Our colleagues in manufacturing and logistics and marketing and finance, they've been using ROI for years. And now HR is catching up. And the standard covers all the major areas of HR, which we've been used to for years, like leadership and succession planning and recruitment and diversity and health and safety and so on. But now there are 60 metrics which underpin this so that we can prove how well we're doing.
Like that's amazing because, like we were just saying, it's so hard sometimes to prove how important HR is. And they're often given, the biggest jobs too. So you talk about organizational change and, working with employees on leadership development. And, one of the things that, I've experienced at, the larger organizations that I've worked at is there's always this big disconnect between, what HR regulations are, and maybe what, a supervisor is looking for in a potential hire. So you get this weird blanket of skills of people that are applying for a job because that's what's in the description, but that supervisor really only wants this like one or maybe two things to focus on. And so they bring all these people in, and then there's this big surprise about how, the supervisor couldn't find someone that was a good fit. And then they're back to the drawing board, and they're wasting time, they're wasting money. Does your system really pay particularly close attention to things like that?
Of course, recruitment, mobility, and turnover is one of the core areas. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, managers have often viewed HR as being the troubleshooters, the fixers. We want this kind of person, go and get me that exact person, who doesn't obviously exist. I think going forward, there are a number of changes. One of them is going to be the adoption of AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to the HR function. And that will help in the shortlisting, the long listing, the recruitment, the interviewing process. The other big changes that I think people are seeing coming out of COVID-19, the future of work is going to be considerably different, and we can align with this. Not just remote working and hybrid working, which are obvious, but many corporations are now asking the big question: what about our real estate? Do we need it? Do we have to pay so much rent? And they're reconfiguring, reframing how offices are going to be used in the future. I think gone are the days when we need so many cubicles, and we need people to come together sometimes. And so there'll be more open spaces for teamwork, for onboarding, for client presentations. And this actually develops the role of HR. So if it's in recruitment, as you were just saying, there'll be much more working together so that HR business partners can be working with their colleagues in different departments and actually deciding what the role is, not I need somebody with those skills. So from the moment the vacancy is identified, HR and the line manager, the head of department, the VP can determine the actual skill set, the job description, the person's specification in advance, rather than trying to sort out the problems afterwards.
Right. That makes a lot more sense. And, would be great time saver. And speaking, of what the pandemic did and time saving, travel has become sort of unnecessary to some degree, or less necessary.
Absolutely.
So,
And I think that many people have seen that their productivity stayed the same or even gone up. Because if I don't have to spend an hour commuting and worrying and stressing and arriving at work in that environment, if I can work from home, where I'm happier looking at my environment and spending more time with the family, I'm feeling better about myself. That's all about engagement and well-being. Then my productivity is going to improve and increase.
right. And for someone that's like a world traveler like yourself, I mean, that's not just an hour commute. That's like some of these places you're talking about going is like, a day of travel just to get there.
Well, let me give you a real example. I've just come off a call earlier today with a lady in Dubai, in the Middle East. And for me to have met her, it would have required huge amount of money, lots of changes of flights, hotels, and I don't think I would have been able to meet her. One man against a lady in the Middle East,
Right.
Dressed in all the stuff. And yet we had a fantastic time. She's in HR. She actually works in the government of Dubai. And we hit it off, and she's very keen on getting certification, ISO 30414 certification for the government of Dubai. And,
awesome.
and working remotely, which my company always has, even before COVID-19, working remotely, and we are paperless. We don't have any paper. It's all electronic documents. Enables us to travel anywhere in the world at a touch of a button. It's a little bit tricky for some of our colleagues in New Zealand and Australia, but they're used to working late at night or early mornings, and I think that's going to be part of the future. That instead of having a huge carbon footprint through gasoline and air travel I think that's going to be questioned.
Yeah. It was interesting because like right after, obviously not to keep talking about the pandemic, but after that happened, consumption of, oil-based, gasoline, all that type of stuff like went way down to the point where you saw a noticeable difference in your environment, right? So
And I don't know about yourself, but I was able to hear birds singing,
yeah, yeah,
and I forget the last time I saw a plane go over.
right. Yeah, it was an amazing difference, and it got very quiet. Like I live out in what we call the boonies. We have 25 acres and a pond. So if you're going to quarantine somewhere, it's a good place to quarantine. But just being able to go out there and hike and, experience nature again, on your lunch break, you know, traveling into a city, you can't really do
Not so
that
much.
when you're working.
Not so-
Right.
And the other thing, Nick, I think that's been happening is that because more people are working from home, it's actually causing a number of managers, leaders, supervisors to question their style. Because in the past, some people at least were saying, well, if I can't see you, I can't trust you.
Right.
That's being questioned. So it's much more mature, it's adult, it's about accountability. And and I think the standard proves this. It's not so much about inputs anymore. It's about outcomes. It's about what will you
Right.
produce.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been in environments and roles where there's a lot of flexibility in my particular position to, be traveling. In fact, a lot of the time, if I was in my office, they were wondering what I was doing because I'm supposed to be meeting people, right? But then the other aspect of that, the other side of that are, your support systems and your executive secretaries and other positions that don't get to travel and do much. And then they want to take, 15 minutes extra to kind of go to the doctor or something like that. And they're getting, flack about it.
Yep.
So totally get it. I think, there is a change coming, and there are still some people that are very or
Yeah, sure.
resisting to that change or trying to figure it out. Maybe would be the
Sure.
better way to explain it.
Sure.
Can you
Sure.
talk a little bit about like what are the types of organizations you're looking at, like size, and then what's your typical functional outline of work? So how does it work out?
Yeah. Um, the standard is applicable across the piece to any organization in the world that's got HR. Um, it's applicable to the private sector, the public sector, the voluntary sector, NGOs, governments, big corporates. Our organization has done its market research, and we're going to be focusing on larger companies, larger organizations, which have got 1,000 employees or more,
Mhm.
simply because you then have an HR function of at least 10 or a dozen people. And we can work with their policies and practices and procedures in that way. But we've had interest from governments, as I mentioned, pharmaceuticals, oil and gas, telecoms, banking. There's an organization in Europe. It's a fisheries company working out of Norway, and they've got 50 fish farms in Scotland.
Mhm.
And it's the world's largest producer of salmon.
Nice. I like salmon.
Most people do. They wanted to bring in-house their salmon feed manufacturing facility. They had a new factory, a load more employees, needed HR, and they're talking to us about it.
Right.
There isn't a sector which hasn't expressed interest in what we're doing.
Okay, so someone expressed interest in your company. What do they expect as far as like rollout and how this program actually
Sure,
gets put into place?
certainly. And if people want to know more, it's hcmmetrics.co.uk.
Okay.
Just get in touch and we'll be happy to have a meeting with you. Essentially, what happens is we go and talk to the people and say, what are your needs? What are your problems? What are your difficulties? We don't start with the metrics. We don't start with the evidence. We don't start with the analytics or the standard. We say, where are your pinch points?
Hmm.
What's hurting? And they say, no, we're fine. We're fine. And so we push it and say, okay, well, what are those things which keep coming up in your meetings? You tried to fix it and it hasn't worked. They say, well, actually, there's so and so and such and such.
Right.
And the solution is usually technology and HR. and we bring them together. We have an awareness raising piece that we do, helping HR and heads of department, VPs to understand the benefits of what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then one of our certificated auditors will go in and ask for their evidence from their HR information system or their human capital management platform. And we take away all their policies, practices, and procedures. And we do a gap analysis between their evidence and the standard. We then return with a traffic light report, red, amber, green.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about conformities. Where is the organization achieving and where are they underachieving? And we say, this is good, this is all not quite so good, and that's missing. And they say, can you help? And we say, well, we'd love to, but in fact, there's a conflict of interest.
Okay.
However, we have got a list of preferred suppliers, HR consultants, who will come in and they will work with them on their succession planning or their diversity or their leadership, whatever it happens to be, for a month or 2 or 3 months. And then the auditor returns and does a whole new audit, and this time find that they're up to standard. We give them a certificate, but we don't abandon them because it's a 3-year rolling plan of continuous improvement. And then after 3 years, there's another certification process.
Okay, so that, you kind of supply, here's your pain points, and you kind of verify that with your statistics, and then you give opportunities for them to kind of fix those issues with some preferred partners, which, I think is a good system, just because then you don't have to have all those different types of HR professionals that are helping you with like diversity and helping you with like leadership. And so there's a variety of different things that you need to be really good at, and you don't have to keep all those people on your team. So what has been, can you tell us one of maybe the biggest challenges you've had with this system, and what you've kind of done to make changes so that it's not a challenge anymore?
Thank you. That's a perceptive question. There are two issues. One is awareness.
Mm-hmm.
The standard actually came out at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, and very few people have heard of it. And that's because the International Standard Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, is not allowed to market their own products. So I'm having to do it for them. Right. And I'm doing my best, but it takes a while. So a week or 2 ago, I was on a webinar with an organization in New York, and they had some CFOs online, and there were 800 of them listening to what we had to say. Because in the US, there have been some regulations with the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, which now require every organization that's publicly listed in the SEC must disclose publicly about their human capital.
Right.
So I'm doing my bit about awareness raising. But when people say, I've never heard of this, and then you tell them about it and say, wow, I've never heard about this, but wow, this is what we've always wanted. The next problem is actually with the HR function itself.
Mm-hmm.
With all due respect to many people who work in HR, they're lovely, lovely people, but classically they're quite traditional,
right,
quite conservative. They're about finding ways around problems and saying to people why they can't do something. So shifting them into a transformational role is sometimes, not always, but in some organizations quite difficult until we outline some of the benefits. We're not there to help, to tell them what to do. We're there to help them do what they do even better and give them the ammunition to do it and prove it.
Right. I run a career support group called TST Career Support. And so some of the pain points that they have is, directly with the traditional HR system, that they really don't think outside of the box and that they stick to the regulations, which, they're supposed to do. Right. But there's some very simplistic things that could change very easily if they only knew the benefits of that. Or maybe they do know the benefits of it, but they just, like you said, I can see how it would be very hard to propose a new thing to, an HR group, especially in larger companies when you're talking about thousands and thousands of employees.
I'll give you an example. In the recruitment, mobility, and turnover area, which you alluded to previously, there are a number of metrics, but there's one which is cost of hire. That's quite easy to assess, or speed of hire. But having come from a learning and development background, many of my colleagues would spend a lot of time and effort and money getting people into the organization. My job was to keep them.
Right.
And that's
Retention.
called quality of hire. And very few organizations will measure that. But there are very easy ways to measure that about people's productivity, how long they stay, how effective they are, how much they cost, and so on and so on. That's quite easy to measure. And certainly the standard would require that. So that's qualitative metrics as opposed to quantitative. And as you say, that makes everybody's life a lot easier.
Yeah, it makes the company look a lot better too, because you've heard it, probably 1,000 times. People that are looking for jobs are also sort of interviewing the company to see if it's a fit for them. And if they can see some of these statistics, and I know a lot of companies like to share what a great place it is to work and whatnot, but if they can see some of the qualitative and quantitative statistics, it's going to make them much more desirable.
You're absolutely right. And potential employees, the candidates, are shopping around. And if they're being interviewed by several organizations at the same time.
Right.
So you make it attractive. And yes, you're right. People will look on your website, and they will look at Glassdoor, and they will look maybe at evidence which is published publicly. But how much better would it be if, in addition to the best companies to work for kind of approach, there was a stamp of approval, reputation, which is international. I was talking to a guy not long ago. Again, he happened to be in the Middle East, and he was dressed like that. And he said, tell me about the standard. So I did tell him about the standard. He was very interested. And then he said, but David, you don't understand. In Oman, we have a different way of thinking. It wouldn't apply here. I said, well, with due respect, no, I've never been to Oman. I've been to many places, but do you know this standard is bigger than Oman? It's even bigger than the United States of America.
Right.
And then he got it. So it's international, it's robust, and it's objective.
Yeah, and you're taking, ideas from all around the world and kind of setting the standard at a certain level and saying this is where you should be and where everyone's trying to attain.
And then you can have benchmarking.
Right.
You can strive for excellence. It's all about good practice.
It's kind of like that's the bonus on top of the other things. So you're getting organized, you're showing your return on investment as an HR department. You're improving time. So time saving is very important. And I think it's even being, much more critically looked at now that we're, in this sort of hybrid model world, how you will use your time and what the company is going to do in the future, it is under, scrutiny. So, we've talked about hiring, we've talked about firing, we've talked about a variety of different traditional HR things. I know some other trends, especially like, in education and, businesses, they talk about diversity. Okay. And they talk about trying to bring in certain different types of, backgrounds of people. How does your standards help them, assess maybe how they're doing, first of all, and then, how they need to improve and what they need to do?
Good. Yeah, there are three big discourses at the moment. One is labor retention. Another is employee engagement or the employee experience. And you're right, it's all about diversity. The standard looks at a number of different areas. Firstly, it's not just the diversity of the new recruits onboarding, but also the diversity of the leadership and management team. It's all very well getting them in, but what about inclusion? And my understanding about the difference between diversity and inclusion is that it's the difference between inviting somebody to a dance and then asking them to dance. And it's about helping them to develop and mature and grow. And we look at obvious things like gender and disability and race and so on.
Right.
But then what the standard does, it gets beneath the surface. So for example, we take nothing as read. We're professionally skeptical. And if they're looking at race, they say, I will ask them the question, well, why are you looking at race? Well, we have to, don't we? I said, well, what do you do with the results? Well, we put them in the filing cabinet. Or they try and measure it against the local population. I said, well, all right, what's the difference between race, nationality, and ethnicity?
Mhm.
And the line goes dead. People
Right.
haven't thought this through. People are aware of the gender pay gap.
Mhm.
What about the race pay gap or the disability pay gap? And
Right.
what we do is just to dig beneath the surface. There's huge amounts of research to say with increased diversity comes increased profit.
Mhm.
Definitely.
Yeah, you can definitely see that in the way that that companies kind of try to bring people on as well is under scrutiny. So like you talk about um, what are the methods that they can use to kind of create attractive places to work for all types of different people. So you mentioned disabilities. Is their company set up their physical location, if we're talking about a physical location, to accept not only employees but customers
Sure.
that might have a disability,
Oh,
and those are challenges that I
yeah.
don't think all companies really think all the way through, because there's just so many different things that you have to address.
My we went to visit my brother-in-law yesterday who's got learning disabilities.
Mhm.
And in the last year, because of COVID, he's now in a wheelchair. And we like to take him out to restaurants and to visit places. And whilst they may be okay about saying that they accept disabled people, what about the height of the table? Will it take
Right,
a wheelchair?
right. Yeah, I mean that's exactly what I was talking to. It's just that that next step, to kind of think about, okay, so now we're bringing a different type of workforce on, or a different customer in. Are they going to feel comfortable in that environment? And
And
make.
one of the big areas of diversity that's coming to the fore for HR at the moment is neurodiversity.
Mhm.
And classically, this would involve people with Asperger's syndrome or uh, on that autistic spectrum,
Right,
many of whom are to be found traditionally, stereotypically within the IT function.
right,
There are people who can shine in certain areas. Whereas if you see on their CV they've got Asperger's, you say, oh, no, we're not. Whereas in fact, that's exactly who you do want.
right. Yeah, and it's also about kind of I wouldn't say teaching, but like helping people to better work together. So, like when you have a workforce that includes a variety of diversity, there's also those HR functions that always seem to come into play about learning to work together effectively and understanding the different types of personalities, even. So, you think about, like, the ENFP and the behavioral type strategies. Uh, a lot of workplace conflict kind of occurs with misunderstandings. So,
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Myers-Briggs. I think I've done a lot of work with teams and leaders over the years, and people said, "Oh, we need to recruit people who are like us, so that they're
right.
going to fit in." I said, "That's the worst thing you can do,
Yeah.
because if you employ a mirror image of yourself, that's called cloning,
Right.
and we know that is dangerous. We need people on teams who are different from ourselves, and
Right.
that creates innovation and creativity."
Yeah. I mean, I used to be a hall director, and I will tell you that, like, when you have a freshman residence hall with the first year students coming in, they're automatically sort of, it doesn't happen so much as often now because they have the internet to meet people. But if they're randomly placed with a roommate, there's so much like tension, and they're so scared. But I will tell you that those relationships worked out much better than the people that chose to live with each other. Because a lot of times you do exactly what you're saying, is you choose to live with your clone. So if both of you don't like, cleaning dishes, or, both of you aren't comfortable with certain aspects of, living together, those problems are always going to be there and escalate. So I used to laugh because whenever we had the room selection process, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but every time we had the room selection process, I'm like, oh, those two people, they're going to live together, and then they're going to be the first people in my office asking them to switch rooms. So,
Yes, sure.
um, okay. You have your international standards, you have your companies that you're set on. Can you tell us a little bit about the types of improvements that you've been able to record and see, and what a company, going with you would expect to see in the
I
end?
was talking to global VP of HR recently, and she was in telecoms, and she had her three very senior team members with her. And it got to that point in the discussion where she was saying, how much does it cost? What are your fees? What are your prices and charges? And I said, I'm sorry, we don't work like that. We work on a completely different basis. It's called value-based billing.
Mm-hmm.
And many colleagues who've worked in professional services like Deloitte's, KPMG, PwC, Ernst & Young, they've been using this for years. And it's about outcomes. It's about return on investment.
Right.
And I said to her, it's about a return on investment. If you're willing to invest in your people, you will see dramatic changes. And then she got it. She said, all right, then, what kind of investment are we talking about? I said, it's up to you. She said, well, and at that point I said, let me give you a hypothetical situation.
Sure.
Have you had a middle manager leave in the last 3 months? She said, yes, of course. I said, so they're on 40, 50K. She said, yes. And how many of those have you got in your company? She said, 100. And I said, classically, what's the labor turnover rate amongst middle managers? She said, that 15%. I said, okay. And you'd like to reduce that by 1 percentage point?
Mm-hmm.
She said, yeah, yes, please. I said, okay. There's no guarantees, but with this standard and with our HR consultants, we can help you reduce your labor turnover amongst your middle managers by 1 percentage point. And the return on investment that she would see is 25% in year one. Mm-hmm. She said, no, that cannot be. You mean 2.5? I said, no, 25% ROI year one from developing your managers and your leaders and reducing that labor turnover rate by 1 percentage point.
That's awesome. So you have a really, really valuable service here, and you are trying to get the word out. And that was like, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on That Sounds Terrific is because we had met a few weeks back, and I thought this was such an interesting model. And I do like that approach to consulting. I've met with a number of consultants, and usually it's that flat fee, and then they kind of try to find that way to kind of stay connected for 3, 4, 5 months afterwards. And here's another add-on. And, but, it's also sort of some of the ones that work out. It's just better for them to have that kind of performance-based metric. The first I heard of it was, it had to do, with a business plan, basically redoing your entire, way that you do business. And we get, 1.5% of, the profits on top of what you normally get, which can be a huge number depending on the, the business. So, so you've been doing this for a number of years. Like, where do you see this, this business going, in the next, 5 years? Where would you like to be?
Well, it's at that point you need to talk to my wife because she's scared. This is going to go through the roof.
Right.
Because if we get this into, say, a large, what shall I say, Home Depot or something like that, mm-hmm. then immediately 2 things will happen. Their major competitors will want it, mm-hmm. and the whole of the supply chain will be required to get it. And it would be the same with the government or the police. It would be the same with health or education.
Right.
My wife's worried about scale because I'm busy at the moment. Fortunately, I'm looking at the supply side, and we have already certified a number of auditors around the world in different time zones who are able to come in and help any organization.
Well, that's awesome. So the sky's the limit, right? As long as your wife's okay with it. That's good, man. You're a good man. So I do want to ask, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you definitely want our listeners to know?
Well, the final thing I'd say, Nick, is that the thing that we haven't touched on is going forward. The other thing that our organization provides, hcmmetrics.co.uk, we also provide a view of the future. The reports that we do all look at the past, what's happened, what's finished, mm-hmm. what's ended. And that's great. But by then, they've given us access to their HR database.
Right.
And we say to the organization, that's great. We can now look for the future. And they say, what do you mean? I say, well, give us your data. We'll put it through our machine. We don't change it at all. But we use some sophisticated statistical software, and we can now predict this time next year what's going to happen. I'd say, how do you do it at the moment? She said, well, blank sheet of paper, or this year plus 10% or something.
Yeah, right.
And I said, well, what we can now do with about 80% accuracy, we can tell them this time next year how many people have been promoted, how many people left because they weren't promoted, how many people have had which kind of accidents at work and how much it cost.
Right.
We can even tell them today, this time next year, how many women are on maternity leave and they haven't even conceived yet.
That's amazing. So that goes back to like your comment about AI becoming more and more important in the workplace and HR, taking advantage of that tool. That's great. So David, I've loved having you on the show.
It's been delightful. Thank you.
Definitely
so
will have all of your links and, connections on our episode notes, and we'll share them on social media as well. Thanks again for being here, David.
It's been delightful. Let's do it again someday.
Definitely.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of That Sounds Terrific. Don't forget to check out the show notes and our website at thatsoundsterrific.com to find the contact information and the best ways to volunteer with the organizations that we feature. If you know someone that is doing terrific things and think they should be featured in a future episode, be sure to email us their name, contact info, and short description of what they're doing at thatsoundsterrific@gmail.com. If you like our show, give us a 5-star rating and give us some social media love by liking our Facebook page, That Sounds Terrific. Follow us on Twitter at Sounds Terrific 2 and Instagram at Sounds Terrific. We love hearing your feedback on how to make our show sound even more terrific. Till next time.